Sonic Mania has been out for a little over 2 months now, and because of my questionable time management skills, I'm finally talking about it. Within days after launch, it received almost unanimous positivity from fans and critics alike, and rightfully so. The game is brought to us by a team of passionate, longtime fans who have proved to us that they know what they're doing. Not only is Mania regarded as the long-lost follow-up to Sonic 3 and Knuckles, but it provides what many consider to be the best 2D Sonic experience, period. And I figured I would give my own explanation as to why I completely agree with that. First of all, the game looks absolutely incredible. Every zone is bright and colorful, but never feels thematically repetitive or overbearing. Even Sonic's sprite pops out more here, opting for a brighter sky blue tone. The sprite animations in general have also seen a boost in quality. And speaking of animation, Tyson Hess created an outstanding opening cinematic that clearly had a lot of thought put into it. And don't even get me started on the soundtrack. Now, it is a Sonic the Hedgehog game, so I knew the music was gonna be great, but man, T-Lopes outdid himself. The presentation as a whole, both graphics and sound, is remarkable in every sense of the word. But where Sonic Mania truly shines is in its gameplay. Sonic is just as nimble and quick as he's ever been. However, he's been given a new ability in the form of the drop dash. By pressing and holding the jump button while in midair, a spin dash will be charged up and released as soon as you hit the ground, adding a ton of speedrunning potential, allowing players to optimize where drop dashes are most effective. In fact, even though I've unlocked the Super Peel Out and Insta Shield for no save mode, I much prefer the drop dash. There's something very progressive about it. It feels right at home with this style of game, and now that I've used it, it's kinda hard to go back. There's also the Combine ring returning from Knuckles Chaotix. It turns your ring counter blue so that if you take a hit, instead of every ring flying out individually, it splits them up into 8 larger rings that are far easier to collect. But the best improvement over Mania's predecessors by far is the widescreen support. The one classic Sonic complaint that's persisted over the years is that you can't react fast enough to what's coming up ahead. And while I think that argument is heavily exaggerated, I can't deny that a handful of stages suffered from it. Thanks to Mania's widescreen, players now have roughly twice as much vision as before. And because the game cleverly and seamlessly slows the player down before getting thrown into a tricky platforming section, there were very few times where I was unfairly damaged. And that's a big deal that often goes unrecognized. Now, Mania's main gimmick is taking the player through a series of old and new levels as a way of celebrating the franchise's history. Unfortunately, this is a big point of contention for a lot of people because we already had a game for the 20th anniversary do exactly that. Not to mention we had Sonic 4 with a very nostalgic premise 1 year prior, Sonic Colors was primarily 2D, and the upcoming Sonic Forces once again has us traveling through Green Hill Zone, so I can understand why a lot of fans would be fatigued from all the callbacks by now. I'm totally fine with there being Green Hill clones. Emerald Hill, Palm Tree Panic, Angel Island, those are all fine. We just don't need to see Green Hill Zone specifically anymore. That being said, coming from a guy who's played this game multiple times, I can confidently say that the returning stages are 90% original. Act 1 of a stage in Mania is essentially a remix of the first 2 acts of the zone it's based on. Act 2 is almost completely original. But whether or not the returning stages bother you in concept, the level designs are inarguably top-notch. Our adventure begins in the iconic Green Hill Zone, a luscious utopian paradise that lets Sonic run around and explore freely. What has always stood out for me about Green Hill, though, is how much depth it has from top to bottom. You can grab some speed shoes and soar over the level by taking the high road, or you can methodically explore the underwater caverns at your leisure. No matter where you are, there's always something for you to do. The elemental shields make a return, and like before, they add a lot to the game's variety, giving Sonic multiple ways of interacting with the environment. A quick fire dash to build up speed and break through walls, a bubble bounce to reach higher areas and breathe underwater, and an electric double jump that magnetizes rings and applies to certain level gimmicks. One of my favorite things to do is see how many rings and extra lives I can rack up. Because Sonic is such a fast character, I can get from one place to another really quickly, making exploration a very accessible feature. And if I'm being honest, that's what defines my ideal Sonic experience. The Act 1 mini-boss for Green Hill is a pretty unique take on the original Wrecking Ball fight, only with a more advanced behavior. I like how when you destroy one of them, the other adopts a new pattern, keeping the fight fresh. The Act 2 boss gave me a good chuckle. Since the Death Egg robot is the final boss in Sonic 2, it was funny to see it in the first zone. I like how it slowly chases you throughout, giving you a chance to dodge the attacks and get to a higher vantage point. It's a pretty strategic fight for such an early boss, and I gotta give him credit for that. Following is the funky, upbeat chemical plant zone from Sonic 2. Act 1 bears a stronger resemblance to the original, but it's still a fast-paced level with a catchy tune and a lot of care put into it. But Act 2 is definitely where things get unique. It uses a similar trampoline gimmick from Sonic CD's Wacky Workbench. By injecting blue and green fluid into the harmful chemicals, it turns it into a jello that Sonic can bounce off of to reach higher areas, and the level really opens up as a result. It's a nice smooth blend of high-speed action and tight platforming. It also has a lot of verticality, which was a nice change of pace from the horizontal Green Hill Zone. But the highlight is without a doubt the boss. The Amoeba droid was decent enough, borrowing elements from Ice Cap, although it does behave somewhat differently. But nobody expected a Mean Bean Machine reference as the main boss, and the surprise was all the more sweet because of it. You can even unlock it in the main menu to play against a friend or the computer. It's a nice touch. Up next is the first original zone, Studiopolis. As its name would suggest, the level is very much based around a studio. Lights, camera, action. Act 1 in particular is one of my favorite levels. It's got a lot of twists and turns, a fast and fun high road, clever platforming, a very unique aesthetic, and one of the catchiest tunes in the game. It's so good. The Heavy Gunner mini-boss is pretty cool too. You run alongside him dodging red missiles and hitting the blue ones back into him, although it does drag just a little bit. It's 4 cycles long and the pattern doesn't change, so it feels a little repetitive. Act 2 is loads of fun as well, with an even greater sense of speed and stronger elements of a casino level. I just wish it was more open. It feels boxed in compared to the previous act, but I really love the microphone and camera enemies throughout. Eggman's weather globe greets you at the end, a machine with a really cool concept of using weather to attack. But because Eggman is hanging so low to the ground, Sonic can easily jump up and hit him several times before he has a chance to attack, and it's kind of disappointing. Oh well. I do love the transition to the next level. You can see Sonic climb aboard the flying battery on the TV monitor. And man, flying battery might just be my favorite zone. And I wasn't expecting that. Studiopolis left some pretty big shoes to fill, but flying battery impresses on every account, especially Act 2. There are so many little details that they threw in that most players won't even notice. Tons of extra lives that require precise movements to be reached, and it makes collecting them all the more satisfying. Like this one part where you can see 2 ring capsules, speed shoes, and a 1-up all next to each other between 2 walls. You can hit a switch to put one of the walls down, but you don't know how to get to the other side. Well, with a little bit of exploring in the upper path towards the end, you can stumble upon the other side with a switch that you can hit to open it up and grab the items. I love stuff like that. Same thing when you delve deeper into the ship. You can run forward as intended, but item boxes hidden in the background can be broken to reveal an upper route with an extra life at the end. These are the kinds of things I live for in video games. Even the Act 1 mini-boss is really good. It tricks you into thinking that you'll be fighting the same boss from Sonic 3 and Knuckles, but then drops you into the scrap heap with a magnetic trash compacting robot called Big Squeeze. I used to think you had to wait for the walls to push the scrap together until you were close enough to land a hit, and you can do that, but with a little momentum, you can bounce off of the magnetized robot that it creates to gain the extra height necessary to make contact. It's really fun. It even teases at the Act 2 Spider Mobile boss with the blueprints on the wall, which is also a good fight. You have to use the momentum from these poles to knock Eggman into the wall of spikes, without getting knocked back yourself. Overall, Flying Battery is a really solid level. I guess I can thank Mario 3 for instilling this love for airship levels into me at a young age. Next up is our second original zone, Press Garden. Thematically, it's one of the most original levels I've seen. Who would have thought to combine a printing press with a garden? You say they're running out of ideas, I say they're just getting started. It's one of the blockier stages in Mania. There's a lot of vertical platforming intertwined with occasional speed sections. There's even a disappearing block gimmick from Mega Man, and it works surprisingly well. You have these bouncy conveyor belts, breakable terrain, these giant presses that try to crush you, Splats the Ink Bunny, and a lot of pleasant surprises. It's not my favorite level, but I can definitely appreciate the variety. Although the mini-boss Shiversaw, despite the cool name, is sadly one of the weakest in the game. You're supposed to wait for it to attack the bronze crates and damage its buzzsaw, creating an opening, but he moves so slow that it turns into a tedious waiting game and it becomes more time efficient to brute force your way through, and that's never a good sign. Thankfully, Press Garden Act 2 brings it back home with an absolutely gorgeous setting. The snowy cherry blossom motif is pure visual beauty. It's like a frozen Mushroom Hill zone. There are plenty of trees and blocks of ice throughout containing loose rings, item capsules, springs, and even spikes. I used to not like this level as much as I enjoyed looking at it, but after grabbing a fire shield early on and melting the ice blocks, I gained a newfound appreciation for it. The same goes for the heavy shinobi boss fight. I used to get irritated from repeatedly being frozen by the sword, and I still do, but with the fire shield, it negates the ice attack, letting me focus on landing hits and dodging the Asteron throwing stars, and it turned into a pretty fun encounter. Not long after, Eggman teleports Sonic away onto Little Planet at Stardust Speedway. Sonic CD was a great candidate to pull levels from because due to its time travel mechanic, every zone had a past, present, good future, and bad future variant to choose from, allowing for more variety. Act 1 is set in the past, and for some reason, I've always had this affinity for Stardust Speedway's past setting. It's oddly nostalgic to me. The Greek pillars in the background, the layers of greenery, the dreamlike skyline, and the super chill music all make me feel at peace. Seriously, this is one of my favorite musical tracks, and one of my favorite levels too. I know CD has become somewhat of a divisive game among fans now, but I've always loved it for sporting a unique set of chaotic levels. It went a little off the rails a couple times, I'll admit, but Mania does tone it down a bit as to not alienate players who weren't fond of that style. It still has a lot of twists and turns of the original, but it's much more controlled this time around. It even borrows elements from Marble Garden Zone of all places, and if you destroy these capsules, it'll plant seeds that grow into a large plant with platforms as leaves, and I'm sorry, but that's just not something you see in many games. Whether at blisteringly high speeds or a meticulous pace, Act 1 is a blast for me. The mini-boss is Hotaru Hiwatt, a larger version of the Firefly Badnik at the end of Sonic CD. Hiwatt flies off pretty quickly and gets replaced by a regular Hotaru. It has a simple behavior of turning vulnerable and firing a laser below. Once defeated, two more will fly in parallel to each other, creating a horizontal laser between them, but they can easily be avoided and jumped into. Hiwatt then makes a return with his own powerful laser attack and sweeps across the ground rather quickly. Act 2 is very fun as well, now being based on the present time. However, it is noticeably more in your face than Act 1. It feels much more focused on going fast rather than exploring. I mean, it is called Stardust Speedway after all, so I can't really fault the developers for that one. But across my multiple playthroughs, I always notice a shift in my playstyle when I get here. I end up trying to finish the level as quickly as I can without really stopping to look around. And while that's not a bad thing, as I've said, exploration is a big part of my ideal Sonic experience. But if a level is gonna focus on speed, I'm glad it at least does it well. Act 2 is an exhilarating level with a ton of shortcuts. There's nothing more satisfying than jumping at just the right moment to soar through the air and shave seconds off your time. I also really like the celebratory fireworks Sonic can hitch a ride on. At the end of the road, we're greeted with a familiar Metal Sonic hologram. After being destroyed, the real Metal Sonic reveals himself and challenges you to a race. This is one of my favorite boss fights, if only for the spectacle. It does go on a little too long, especially on your first playthrough, but I've gotta give him props for designing such a detailed fight. The race begins very similarly to the original, only with Metal Sonic occasionally charging the player after a brief audio cue. Shortly after, you'll come into a room where Metal Sonic hijacks one of Eggman's machines to summon mini Silver Sonic replicas. This is somewhat of a beginner's trap because it's not exactly clear what you have to do. You might think you have to destroy the clones, but in actuality, you need to wait for one of them to charge up a spin dash and collide with it using your own, bouncing it back to hopefully ricochet into Metal Sonic. The quickest method I found is charging a drop dash or a single spin dash when Silver Sonic is directly in front of the hatch, and charging a full spin dash when he's off to the left or right. This way you'll never under or overshoot your target. The race will then resume until you ascend into the top floor, with a wall of spikes forming behind you. Now you have to carefully land hits on Metal Sonic without falling behind or going too far ahead. Every now and then he'll move ahead to shoot a fairly easy to dodge electrical attack, but then it's back to the grind until that final hit. While a little overly ambitious at times, the Metal Sonic fight is fast, interesting, multi-layered, intense, got a good tune, and that rotating Eggman statue in the background really adds to the apocalyptic setting. After a quick screen transition, we fall into Hydrocity Zone, Mania's water level taken from Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Contrary to popular opinion, I generally don't mind water levels in Sonic games because there are often ways to avoid most of the water. Aquatic Ruin, Tidal Tempest, the original Hydrocity, these are all zones that give you opportunities to stay out of of the water by taking the high road. Heck, even Labyrinth Zone has a really neat shortcut in the beginning. But Mania's version of Hydrocity, specifically Act 1, really wants you to be underwater. I did find a cool alternate route that brought me up to the surface, but after that, it starts pushing me to the bottom. And while I appreciate the Game Gear callback and how intricate the lower part of the stage is, this kind of slow-paced, uneventful gameplay doesn't do much for me, and it tends to drag. It's not bad by any means, it's perfectly sound, but this is definitely my least favorite zone when compared to the others. To be fair, Act 2 is much better in this regard. I can circumvent almost all of the water, and there's plenty of speed to be had, but it does feel like I'm along for the ride more than usual, and I don't feel as encouraged to explore as I normally do. Again, I don't think it's bad, but rather unremarkable. My favorite parts of Hydrocity are the bosses. Act 1 has Sonic and Eggman switching roles from the original Act 2 boss, and it's all kinds of comedic irony. I had a huge grin on my face. But the Laundromobile has stolen my heart as my second favorite boss. You're moving through a continual water current at high speeds, activating bombs to lure Eggman into. But because you're underwater, you have to grab an air bubble at some point, which are conveniently produced from the bomb explosions, creating a really smart player-environment relationship. You're always looking out in front of you to dodge incoming spikes, and plan your movements to the next bomb before you run out of air. And there's never a dull moment because of it. In Phase 2, you drop into a room to fight the original Act 1 mini-boss. It's a cool reference, but if I'm being honest, it feels like an anticlimactic finish to an otherwise exhilarating fight. It's not like there's anything different here, it's the same boss, only with Mania's coat of paint, so it comes off as unnecessary. Aside from that nitpick though, this is, to me, how every boss should be made. Thrilling, strategic, and fair. Up next is our third original zone, Mirage Saloon, a level I was greatly anticipating. But to my surprise, the entirety of Act 1 is an homage to Sonic 2's Sky Chase Zone, an auto-scrolling level where you fly aboard the tornado. Now, both of these incarnations are visually and musically beautiful, but auto-scrollers have this reputation of being inevitable pace breakers, because no matter how well or differently you play the level, it will always take the same amount of time to complete. And it can get boring sitting around waiting for the level to finish. To mitigate this issue, a few changes were made. The speed at which the screen moves has been necessarily increased. You don't feel like you're waiting around nearly as much, and the action flies by you at a higher rate. Best of all though, they added a brief section where Sonic hitches a ride on a train and gets to run freely. I feel like they could have made the entire act take place on this train and saved the tornado part for the boss, and nobody would have complained. Just saying. Sonic jumps into a giant gun and gets fired back onto the tornado, where the heavy magician shows back up and releases an uber caterpillar that jumps out from the background and occasionally the left and right. It's a cool boss, but it can be really awkward trying to time your hits. The depth perception isn't very clear, so you can wind up missing a lot of your jumps and getting harmed in the process. One of 3 obscure Sonic characters will then appear and damage the plane, sending you into Act 2, and this is another one of my favorite levels. It takes on an upbeat Western aesthetic, and has so many fun gimmicks sprinkled throughout that makes it one of the most enjoyable playgrounds I've had the pleasure of running through. The barrels, the guns, the seltzer, the bouncy piano keys, and the music, once again, is outstanding. My only complaint? It's too short. Since Act 1 was primarily automated, it feels like the level's only just begun. And the boss, while it was cool to see Bean, Bark, and Fang return, even if they were only illusions, is pretty mediocre. You just wait, then attack, and yeah, Sonic hops into another pistol and is fired into the distance, where we can see a mysterious-looking city that turns out to be none other than Oil Ocean Zone. Of all of the Sonic 2 levels, I was not expecting this one to make a return. However, it doesn't completely come out of nowhere. On the train in Act 1, there's cargo with a familiar purple and bronze pattern, and is also labeled as Ooze, which is an abbreviation for Oil Ocean Zone. I gotta say, this was a pleasant surprise. I wasn't expecting this to be as enjoyable as it was. It can get a little blocky at times, but it's a solid zone. I like Act 2 in particular for having these hidden submarines that take you to a short obstacle course. This is the sort of detail that adds a ton of character to a level, and being able to ignite the oil using the fire shield is the icing on the cake. It was also cool that they were able to use a Sandopolis gimmick that was actually enjoyable. The air is slowly becoming more polluted over time, and the only way to purify it is by pulling these levers. If you fail to do this, then your vision will become heavily obscured by a thick orange fog that begins to drain your rings. The Act 1 meter droid is kind of a joke though. It leaves itself wide open when moving side to side, and its only form of attack is tossing an adjustable spanner in your direction. It'll move into the background to turn a valve that pushes the lids that you're standing on into the ceiling, but by staying in the middle, you'll avoid the spikes above with ease. The only problem here is that the spikes are completely out of frame when at ground level, so there's no way to prepare you for the impact, putting you at a big risk for unfair damage. The Mega Octus, on the other hand, is really good. It starts out as an extension of the original chained harpoon fight, but instead of Eggman rising from the oil, two mechanical tentacles will emerge, pulling the platforms down and attempting to shoot you before you can land any hits on the Mega Octus. This was the first time that I had died multiple times on a boss thus far, so I applaud them for making something more difficult. Next up is Lava Reef Zone, and I know I've said this a lot, but this is another one of my favorites. It has a really nice blend of horizontal and vertical platforming. It always feels like there's something new around the corner no matter where I go. It also does a really good job at giving you room to run fast, but still slowing you down when appropriate. It's never one-sided. The fire pillars in Act 2 were a little hard to see at points, but it wasn't enough to severely compromise my enjoyment. Act 1 takes place in a volcanic mine, using elements of the Sonic 3 multiplayer level, Endless Mine, and the Rexon dinosaur badniks from Hilltop Zone, who get brutally crushed by a machine reminiscent of one found in Metallic Madness Zone. And Act 2 is a crystallized cavern, implementing a conveyor belt system similar to Quartz Quadrant. Something that really stood out to me though were the backgrounds. Aside from Pressguard in Act 2 and Stardust Speedway Act 1, no other background grabbed my attention like it did here. When I look at these, I see a story ready to be told that I can't quite understand, but it's piqued my curiosity for sure. And the beautiful guitar playing in the back complements my intrigue. The Driller Droid is similar to the Mystic Cave boss, only a lot more aggressive. It locks onto your current position to try and land on you, very much like the Death Egg robot, and causes stalactites to fall from the ceiling by drilling into the ground. However, by drilling into the lava below, its armor begins to overheat, and after 3 cycles of that, it breaks off, leaving it vulnerable. If it's still alive and all of the rock has been drilled through, it'll start dropping spike balls to destroy the platforms, creating a bottomless pit each time. The Heavy Rider at the end is something that I've warmed up to. I didn't like it very much at first because it was hard to read and the timing was precise, but after some practice, I've come around on it. She's taken control of a crazed moto bug and charges from either the side of the screen, swinging a ball and chain with a really small margin of error, ramming you head on with it requiring a quick dodge, or riding the track in the background, activating the 2 flame pillars, accompanied by the sounds of children. Why not? We've now arrived at the penultimate zone of the game, Metallic Madness. Now, naturally, you want the levels in a game to get more difficult as they go on, with the first level being the easy tutorial, and the final level being the challenging last stand where you apply all of the skills that you've learned. Well, Sonic has struggled with this in the past. You can't just plaster a ton of enemies, spikes, and bottomless pits everywhere and call it difficult, because without proper implementation, it can end up turning into a huge mess. And because Sonic is virtually invincible to touch damage, enemies don't pose much of a threat anyway. So, what does Mania end up doing? Is it a Metropolis zone or a Death Egg zone? Well, it pleases me to say they chose the latter. Metallic Madness is loads of fun, and I'm happy that I can say that, because as much as I love Sonic CD, even I have to admit that Metallic Madness was the weakest level. I was concerned that Mania's version was going to be awkward and convoluted to play through, but I can now lay those fears to rest. It maintains the same degree of high-speed platforming that the rest of the game has already showcased, while also retaining its own wacky factory vibe with buzzsaws and other lethal machinery. What really sells me on it, though, is when Sonic is bounced into the background and you get to play from that perspective. It's such a cool idea that only talented developers could come up with. It can be a little disorienting to focus on something beyond the foreground, but they've already planned around this possibility, as these sections never last longer than 20-30 seconds tops. Act 2 reuses the same shrink ray gimmick from the original zone, only it expands upon it much further. You frequently go in and out of this miniature state, and there are plenty of areas that only Mini Sonic can get through. You fight the Egg Pistons at the end of Act 1, a revamped model of the Sonic 1 final boss. Eggman will choose a random pillar to control and try to crush you with all 5. Since you never know which piston he'll be inside of, you have to keep on your toes and react quickly to land your hits and avoid being crushed. When the machine is close to being destroyed, it'll enter a short pincher mode where it'll speed up its attack rate, raising the stakes. One of the more enjoyable fights, I gotta say. But nothing beats the Gachan Pandora prize machine box in Act 2. If it wasn't charming enough that you had to fight the whole thing as miniature Sonic, the boss also drops miniature versions of Eggman's past machines, including a robotic doll of Amy Rose. What's neat is how you can choose to fight them one at a time by turning the knob, or all at once for a hectic battle, which you get an achievement for. And of course, the music is fantastic. I really like the vocal sampling in Act 1, but the saxophone solo in Act 2 has won me over. With everything else out of the way, we've approached the final zone of the game, and it's an original one to boot, Sonic Mania. It hits you hard straight away with a super foreboding musical piece, and a menacing dystopian setting that reminds me a lot of Final Fortress from Sonic Heroes. The emphasis on the color red lends itself well to the idea of running along a red carpet, leading up to something big, and the regal flags placed throughout only accentuate that motif. But unlike Metallic Madness, which had a funky nature about it, Sonic Mania wants to be serious. You're constantly hopping over spikes, electricity, and a variety of enemies and stage mechanics returning from past levels. You've got elements from Scrap Brain, Metropolis, Death Egg, and even the Sonic 3 bonus stages, in addition to its own unique mechanics. Act 2 takes an unorthodox approach and has you clear 4 separate areas of the stage and meet up at a central room after each one before fighting the boss. You also have to be on the lookout for these purple time warps. They'll send you back a few screens to retry an area if you fall into one. A common complaint with Metallic Madness is that it's too long, and normally I would be bothered by a level that lasts more than 3 to 5 minutes, but since this is the final zone, it feels appropriate. What does bother me is the linearity of it. Aside from a few goodies here and there, you're running through the same path every time, and it doesn't give me the same encouragement to replay through it like the other zones do. Crimson Eye returns as the Act 1 mini-boss, and he's just as difficult as he was before. His second form can feel more like a waiting game than an actual fight, but it does have a pretty cool gravity gimmick. When Act 2 has been fully completed, a portal will open up that takes you to the final boss room. You run to the right, the lights go dim, and Eggman drops down controlling the Phantom Egg, a contraption based on the original design to the Sonic CD final boss. He'll put up a barrier to protect his body as he jumps around the room using 4 mechanical arms. When he lands, he'll lower his shield to power up an electrical attack that requires careful evasion. However, this is the only time when you can do any damage, so timing and placement are critical. Every few hits, one of the appendages will be destroyed, giving you more leeway, and he'll often throw out 4 homing missiles that are pretty easy to dodge. After a bit, he'll return to the middle and summon 2 Phantom Hands that transport you to a separate room to endure a mini-boss. I say endure because you don't actually have to deal any damage. There's a timer that'll bring you back to the main room when it's been long enough. But I gotta give him credit for having this much creativity even at the tail end of the game. But alas, after the final hit, Eggman is defeated. We get treated to a nice ending cinematic, and the credits roll. But it wouldn't be a Sonic the Hedgehog game without the 7 Chaos Emeralds and a true final boss. There are giant rings hidden throughout every act in the game that take you to a special stage, and completing one will award you with a Chaos Emerald. I've been quite fond of special stages in the past, some more than others, but I think I've found a new favorite. The psychedelic backgrounds take clear inspiration from the Sonic 1 and CD special stages, and the linear 3D structure is very akin to the Sonic 2 and 3D Blast half-pipe. Even the ring counter was taken from Knuckles Chaotix. You begin each stage with an amount of rings that act as a timer, slowly constantly counting down. You can increase it by collecting more, but you also need to grab blue spheres to increase your speed. There's a UFO up ahead holding the Chaos Emerald, and the only way to catch it is to build up your speed meter to Mach 2 and 3. It immediately becomes an internal balancing of both time and speed. Do I go after the blue spheres to catch up quicker, or do I go for the rings because I won't make it in time? These are the questions that make these special stages so much more visceral than before. You start learning how to cut corners and take shortcuts, but it never feels cheap or unplanned. On the contrary, it feels both intentional and intuitive to how Sonic controls. The handling will definitely take some getting used to. It feels more like a racing minigame than a platformer, but the game never asks too much from the player to where it becomes an issue. These are definitely the best special stages so far, and I have to commend them for making them so well. Now, there are also bonus stages that can be accessed by jumping into the stars of a checkpoint after crossing with 25 or more rings. It's cool to see Blue Sphere getting some love finally, but I was never a huge fan to begin with. A lot of the maps end up feeling the same, and I don't really care for the pseudo top-down perspective, but it is optional, so I don't mind. However, I would have liked to see more traditional bonus stages return. Sonic 3 and Knuckles had 3 different types, and they were a great way to score extra rings and change up your elemental shield. It's definitely something I would like to see return for a sequel. Once you've collected all 7 Chaos Emeralds, you can transform into Super Sonic, which is pretty much the ultimate reward for completionists. Invincibility, super speed, a higher jump, the works. Not every piece of level design complements your newfound power, but this is something I can overlook. Now that we have all the Chaos Emeralds, we can head back to Titanic Monarch to face the true final boss, the Egg Reverie. Eggman and the Heavy King are fighting over the Phantom Ruby, and it's up to Sonic to take them both out. Heavy King has an electrical attack that acts as a barrier and can knock a bunch of your rings out. If you wait for it to pass, he'll have no more protection and you can do some damage, knocking the ruby out of his grasp. Then Eggman will grab it and he just kind of pushes you around, so he's much easier to hit, but since your rings are slowly depleting while in your super form, you'll need to be sure to grab any that float by, which is a lot easier here because they're drawn to you. Honestly though, this battle was kind of underwhelming. I was expecting something huge and epic, something to wow me, but it ended up being a pretty average fight. The one thing I do love about the Egg Reverie though is the music. It's one of my favorite pieces in the game. When that guitar kicks in, I get chills. Sonic lands one final hit and is suddenly sucked into the portal, acting as a precursor to Sonic Forces. We get a slightly different ending cinematic this time, and the credits roll once again. That is Sonic Mania. If it wasn't obvious enough already, this game is fantastic. It knew exactly what its target audience wanted and satisfied on every level imaginable. The game looks incredible, the soundtrack is phenomenal, the level design and stage variety is top-notch, there are 3 playable characters, and tons of unlockable bonus features, all for a modest $20 price tag. Sonic Mania is, to me, the best Sonic game so far. Sonic 3 and Knuckles is great, but even it has Sandopolis Zone, and the 4:3 aspect ratio isn't always flattering. The only genuine complaints that I have are nothing more than nitpicks. In the end, I couldn't be happier with the result, and I look forward to the future. Those are my thoughts on Sonic Mania. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, don't forget to check out the next episode whenever I post it, which will probably be soon. Alright, see ya.